Good evening, men, good afternoon, women, and good morning, children. Today is Wednesday, we are getting the reset of this week's in EU as well, and with the weekly reset, what we also get is a set of hotfixes that will have now gone live in Europe as well, about several dungeons of Season 4 getting even further nerfed, and we also get more nerfs to the two already previously nerfed specs of Season 4. So this is going to be the topic of discussion for today, basically nerfs. The TLDR of this week is nerfs. Let's just start with the first set of nerfs, which is the one to the specs, not to the dungeons. These specs in question are, of course, Destruction, Warlock and Survival Hunter, which now get even further nerfs to their AoE. This is now starting to get quite hilarious. Blizzard nerfed these two specs early on in Season 3, but it was a very light slap on the wrist. And then they nerfed them at the start of Season 4, and it was a further light slap on the wrist. And then just a week after the nerfs, they are now further nerfing them. This just shows you how light, how soft Blizzard went when it came to nerfing these two specs, because they could have gone for this much earlier on. I struggle to believe that Blizzard wasn't aware that any of these nerfs would not have been enough on its own to curb the AoE damage of these two specs. Nevertheless, we're now getting even more nerfs. The nerf to Destruction Warlock is without compensation. There is no complexity here in balancing some more buffs in their single target because they are nerfing the AoE damage, etc, etc. It's just a flat out nerf. Destruction is now doing 20% less damage to Rain of Fire and is doing 20% less damage to the Immolation aura of the Infernal. Not really much else to say about this. Rain of Fire is going to be at the very minimum 25% of your damage in Mythic Plus roughly, so this is at minimum a 5% overall damage nerf to all of your damage, and the Infernal Immolation aura is about also 20-ish% of your damage, so nerfing it by 20% is another 4% nerf. So overall this nets you more or less a 10% AoE nerf to Destruction. It was previously the one at the start of Season 4 was somewhat in the range of a 20% AoE damage nerf for Destruction, and now you get another 10% AoE damage nerf to Destruction. If you want a funny TLDR, if you want to look at this from the hilarious point of view, this is still not enough. This is still going to keep Destruction as the strongest AoE spec in the game, at the very least for range DPS. This is how much further ahead they are from all of the other specs. So we have the nerf for Destruction, which is still likely not going to change the meta. And then we have the nerf to Survival. Now, the difference between Destruction and between Survival is that somehow, some way, Blizzard believes that Survival is not that far ahead compared to Destruction, which means every time they went on ahead to nerf their AoE, they have also buffed their single target. They did this last nerf as well, and they are doing it now, because they are nerfing the 4-piece set bonus of your tier set, so that now Med Bombardier damage bonus has been reduced to 50% instead of 70. It used to be 100 and then 70 and now 50, so it's basically being cut in half since the first set of nerfs. However, what comes along this AoE nerf to your bombs is also a 20% more damage to Raptor Strike or to Mongoose Bite if you have the talent, and then 20% more damage to Serpent Sting, and then 20% more damage to Kill Command. This is going to be netting again a nerf to AoE, to the AoE of Survival, and a buff to the single target of Survival. So it's not as bad as the nerf to Destruction, which is just an all-around plain nerf to AoE, and even a slight nerf to single target, since the Infernal is still used in your single target damage, whereas Survival gets at the very least a trade-off for more single target damage. Now, the TLDR of both of these nerfs is that likely none of these two nerfs is actually going to take away the position, the spot that these two specs have in the meta. It is still going to be Survival as the stronger of the melee picks, together with Outlaw and Windwalker, which they are more or less already in right now, and Destruction was already the most broth of the range specs in Mythic Plus, as we just got our Mythic Plus video yesterday. With this nerf, perhaps Fire Mage might get closer to being more broth in the meta, perhaps more Warlocks might start looking into Demonology technology, as a change, as a swap from destruction, but overall I don't think this is going to be too drastic of a change. Their niche, at the very least, their niche of their AoE damage is still there, regardless of the amount of nerfs that they have received to their AoE damage, which is once again just highlighting how out of scope, just how much more powerful they were compared to all of the other specs, if these are the set of nerfs needed to even start considering alternatives to these two specs in AoE situations. So quite bad from Blizzard to have this on their resume as a pretty bad way to balance these specs over the last like 5 months since the start of Season 3. Then we have something that is going to impact a little bit more of the player base, even though technically a Survival Hunter or a Destro will be in almost every group anyways. Another thing that will impact most people is of course the nerfs that the dungeons have received. So not just these two specs have gotten nerfed, also the Mythic Plus keys. Now, to no surprise, the larger nerfs, or rather the focus of the nerfs to the Mythic Plus keys, have gone to Grimrail Depot, to Iron Docks, and to Upper and Lower Karazhan. So absolutely no surprise that the Tazavesh dungeons have not been touched, and also that the Mechacon dungeons have not been touched, because they are already quite nicely balanced. The problems, as I touched on yesterday when I said I could have gone in detail, but I didn't, was the fact that Mythic Plus dungeons from Legion were vastly different than the way Mythic Plus worked in BFA and Shadowlands, and then Warlocks, of course, didn't even have Mythic Plus. So there were quite a few mechanics that basically one-shot you or do unreasonably high damage, which make it extremely difficult the higher you go in keys to deal with it. Whereas BFA and Shadowlands tuned the mechanics of the dungeons to work with the idea of scaling keys in mind, these older boomer dungeons were not as nicely balanced. So the set of nerfs that we get. So in every key we have the nerf to Zul'Gamox, which is the mini-boss of the Dreadlords that you can find in your key. Zul'Gamox now casts Blood Barrier less often. This was pretty much the main problem of Zul'Gamox when you fight him. The bat is not the problem, it's easily crowd controlled. His AoE Shadow Explosion is not a problem because you have to be blind to not see it and move out of the way, and the sleep pool on the ground that moves around is also not too big of an issue. The main issue was the time. The main issue was the drag of this mini-boss every time he went into the Blood Barrier and then he heals himself, and the damage you're doing is just absorbed by the Blood Barrier, so it was just very long. It was just very boring to go through, to chew through this mini-boss. So now we will see just how much he's going to be casting Blood Barrier throughout his stay. I think 3 times, something like at 70%, 50% and 25% HP, a scripted Blood Barrier cast would be enough to make this boss reasonably annoying, rather than casting it every 15 seconds like he does now. So the first nerf is very appreciated to Zul'Gamox. It's definitely going to shave off some time if you were even still dealing with this guy and not skipping him throughout your dungeons. Then we have the nerf to the actual dungeons themselves. The first in line is the nerf to Grimrail Depot. Now, Grimrail Depot is not actually one of the harder ones. We touched on yesterday when looking at the Mythic Plus keys is that the Karazhan dungeons are much more of an issue than Grimrail Depot, but still, the Gromkar Farseer's Storm Shield can now be purged. This is not too big of an issue. Plus, you can also interrupt and stop the shield itself from being applied. Also, Gromkar's Cinderseer will now no longer cast Lava Wrath, which is okay, but again, not too big of an issue, which is exactly what I was expecting from Grimrail Depot. These nerfs are not even that significant. When it comes to the bosses, these are more significant. Railmaster Rocket Spark, so the first boss of Grimrail Depot, Borka the Brute's Mad Dash damage reduced by 30%. This was the flat-out, party-wide, big chunk of damage that the boss was doing. You know, it was a very high amount of damage. You know, by the time you start getting into keys higher than 25, this was nearly one-shotting players And this was a repeated cast. It was like on a 30-second cooldown or something along those lines. So, of course, this was definitely not the type of ability you would expect from Mythic Plus keys, from mechanics in Mythic Plus keys. This type of borderline one-shotting mechanic. And what's worse, this wasn't even to a single player. This was to the entire party. So it was kind of rough to deal with. Lastly, you have the nerf to Skylord Tovra. Perhaps one of the more dangerous things she does is Thunderous Breath. So I'm sure you might have read or looked at some guides, you know, the idea of splitting the platform of the boss into 9 spaces and try to split as many players into as many different platforms as possible, so you can spread and avoid taking damage as much as possible from this ability, Thunderous Breath. The initial damage of this ability, not the tick that is left behind if you get hit by the ability, just the initial hit, is nerfed by 25%. This is perhaps even better because there is, you know, this sort of cheese mechanic right here, where if you stay on the very edges, on the very 4 edges, the wooden edges right there, you can actually avoid getting the dot, because you're not technically standing on the ground that was lit up by lightning. So you take the initial damage, which has now been nerfed, but you won't take the dot if you stay in these positions. So it's good that the part that gets nerfed of this ability is the initial damage. Then we move on to Iron Docks, another dungeon which is not too terribly overtuned or overpowered in its abilities. There are, however, a couple of things that have been found to be annoying, one which gets fixed right now in this hotfix. Flesh Render Knockgar. Dreadfang's shredding swipes should no longer hit players multiple times. This was something you might have noticed as soon as you split the boss from his mount. As soon as he reaches 50%, sometimes 1 or 2 players would just get instantly one-shot because the dog would start casting his shredding swipes and hit certain players something like 4 times in no seconds immediately. Now this is much more manageable. It's now much more easy to just bloodlust and burn down the dog before he causes too many problems. We also have a nerf, another one, perhaps pretty much the only difficult, the only dangerous part of Oshir, the cat boss. Feeding Frenzy now requires Oshir to suffer 5% damage to be interrupted instead of 8%. Feeding Frenzy, of course, is the one where he just starts feeding on one of your party members and they start taking quite a lot of damage over time. This is also another one of those definitely not the kind of ability you want to see in Mythic Plus, because by the time you start getting into high keys, this would start essentially to be unhealable and unblockable and unstoppable. So nerfing the amount of damage you need to do to the boss to break free your friend before he dies is definitely helpful. Lastly, we have the nerfs to Skullock. The Skullock's melee damage has been reduced by 15%, so that he's gonna hit the tank for less. I didn't find this to be a major issue, but maybe I was not paying too much attention. And then Koramar will no longer cast Shattering Blade. Not that relevant. You wanna get rid of Koramar quite quickly. Shattering Blade is probably gonna do damage in the first 30 seconds, even less actually, 10-15 seconds or so. So I'm not too sure why this was removed altogether rather than being nerfed even, but okay, fine. Then we have the nerfs to the actual 2 worst dungeons at the moment, Karazhan Lower and Upper. Karazhan Lower, it's the worst one of the 2 by far. Karazhan Lower has Ghostly Philanthropist no longer cast Throw Coin. Now don't be confused, this isn't the channeled ability, the one that keeps spamming the coins on the ground, which 2-shots melees and tanks every single time. This is the targeted ability, the targeted spam throw coin. It's a different one. Then you have the Gang Ruffian's Poisonous Shank damage, which has been reduced by 30%. This is not too big of a deal. You have the Opera Hall Wicket, which has gotten the Winged Assistant health reduced by 30%. This one looks like a preemptive nerf, since this last week, the first week of Season 4, we didn't have the Opera Hall, the Wicket Opera event available, so it looks like Blizzard is nerfing it ahead of time. And then you have Moros. Moro's Garrote duration has been reduced to 1 minute when it used to be permanent. Not that problematic, it's more of an issue about its damage rather than how long it lasts. And then Moro's Dinner Party effect now increases the damage and attack speed of nearby dinner guests by 50% instead of 100%. If you want a tip, by the way, for Moros, if you're playing with a paladin in your group, have the paladin Blessing of Protection, the healer, right before Moros is about to cast the Garrote again, because Moros is always going to target the healer. So if the healer has Garrote, 2 seconds, 1 second, 3 seconds before Moros casts Garrote again, you Blessing of Protection the healer. The bop removes the first bleed. Moros sees that the healer doesn't have a Garrote, tries to cast Garrote on the healer again, but the healer still has Blessing of Protection on, which immunes the Garrote. So that's a nice, neat trick to deal with Garrote on Moros. Lastly, you have the last nerf to Karazhan Upper instead, which is only one nerf to Upper Karazhan, and that's to Medivh. The Flame Wrath damage has been reduced by 30%. It's quite hefty damage actually. Flame Wrath, even if you don't fail the actual mechanic, the dots of Flame Wrath are quite massive. It's a similar issue to the dots that are left behind by the consecration, by the pools on the ground of the Maiden of Virtue. In fact, the Maiden of Virtue's pools are so heavy, they tick for so hard. Another tip, if you have a way to damage yourself, you should definitely break the repentance mechanic by not stepping on those pools and getting a dot ticking for like 20k damage per second on yourself. So if you are, for example, a Warlock with Burning Rush, just enable Burning Rush and break Repentance that way. If you have the Jailer Trinket, that is also a viable way to do lower Karazhan. Use the Jailer Trinket that gives you the bleed every 2 seconds, so you can break Repentance without having to step on the pools as well. So it's nice that the Flame Wrath of Medivh gets nerfed. It was definitely one of the more dangerous parts of the encounter. Assuming, of course, we live in a fantasy world where there is no smooth brains actually moving out of the Flame Wrath and just killing everyone. But so far, these have been the nerfs that Blizzard has planned for the dungeons. As I said, quite expected that easier dungeons, the currently easier dungeons, like the Tazavesh dungeons and the Mechagon dungeons, weren't really touched in balancing. Blizzard has done plenty of the balancing for these dungeons throughout BFA and throughout Shadowlands, so they had really no need to further tune them. More of the tuning was required for the older, less tested dungeons, like the Karazhan ones and then the Warlocks of Draenor ones. So with this set of nerfs, these dungeons should be now much more manageable. I still don't think it's going to change the ranking, the difficulty ranking of the dungeons. I definitely still think both of the Karazhan dungeons stay at the bottom when it comes to ease of completion. And then we will also see how much of an impact the nerfs to destruction and to survival will actually have in the overall meta of Mythic Plus. So, with this being said, I can now leave you to the rest of your Wednesday. As usual, of course, I have to say a round of applause to all of the supporters on my Patreon. This is going to be making it much more easy to continue to provide content for all of you guys throughout this alpha phase of Dragonflight and then the beta phase of Dragonflight as we go through the last season of Shadowlands as well. What you can also do to support is to like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Welcomed comments for this video are going to be about which of the keys you have enjoyed the most so far, or rather which of the keys you have enjoyed the least so far, just to see how many are in agreement that the Karazhan dungeons are at the moment slightly, maybe not even slightly, overtuned compared to the rest of the dungeon pool of Season 4. And then lastly, for the more parasocial friends, you can also follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right down at these 2 links. Subscribing, which of course will also give you access to my Discord server. If you ever want to get closer, have a chat, discuss a few things, I'm usually available on Discord for that. With all of this being said and done, we can now leave for real. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, okay, fine. For once, my weathermen and forecast women have gotten it right. Temperature has gone down. It's not nearly as hot. It looks like it's gonna continue like this for a while. So, okay, you are partially redeemed for now.